Judith sat in her small apartment in Lagos, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The one-room flat, tucked away in the corner of a busy neighborhood, felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. Her son, Tolu, was at school, leaving her with the silence she had become all too familiar with. The silence that echoed her deepest fears. The silence that had been her constant companion during the years of struggle. It had been months since she last worked. Job applications piled up, rejection emails poured in, and every day felt like a battle she was losing. She had a law degree, the ambition, and the drive. But in a city like Lagos, where opportunities seemed as scarce as affordable housing, it felt like all of her efforts were in vain. Judith was a single mother, raising her son alone, with no family to lean on. Her ex-husband had disappeared after the divorce, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a broken life. She remembered the days before the joblessness took over her. The days when she was full of hope, wearing a crisp suit, rushing from one interview to another, dreaming of making it big in one of the prestigious law firms in Lagos. But that was before reality had hit her like a cold splash of water. Her son needed her more than ever, and each day that passed without a job was another reminder of her failure. Then one afternoon, as she was sitting in the cramped living room, nursing the familiar ache of doubt, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old law school friend, Ada. Judith had not heard from her in years, but Ada's message was like a light in the darkness. "Judith, I have a lead for you. There's a junior associate position available at Harrison & Company. They're looking for someone exactly like you. Apply. You'll do great." For a moment, Judith stared at the screen, unsure whether to believe it. It had been so long since someone had believed in her, had given her a chance. She had been rejected so many times, told she wasn't good enough. But Ada's words felt different, like a lifeline thrown her way. Without wasting a second, Judith opened the application, her hands trembling. She typed out the most heartfelt cover letter she had ever written, sharing not just her qualifications, but the story of the woman she had become. A mother. A survivor. A woman who had not given up, even when it seemed like the world had given up on her. 2 days later, she received the call that would change everything. Harrison & Company, one of the top law firms in Lagos, wanted her to come in for an interview. The excitement that surged through her veins felt surreal. The world had just opened up a new door for her, but this was just the beginning. As Judith stood in front of her bathroom mirror, preparing for the interview, she looked at herself. No longer just a woman fighting for a job, but a woman with a purpose, a mother who was going to make sure that her son would never know the pain of living in uncertainty. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Judith believed she could face it. Judith could hardly contain her excitement as she walked out of the interview room at Harrison & Company. The panel had been kind, asking questions that tested both her knowledge and character. It felt like a blur, but she knew one thing for sure: she had nailed it. The call came later that afternoon. "Judith, we're pleased to offer you the position of junior associate with our firm," the voice on the other end said, and Judith's heart nearly skipped a beat. She had done it. She had finally found her way into the world of corporate law in Lagos. Her first day at the firm was a whirlwind of new faces, bustling offices, and the sweet promise of a fresh start. Judith tried to absorb everything, eager to prove her worth. She was assigned to a small team, working under a senior associate who had a reputation for being demanding, but Judith didn't mind. She was ready for the challenge. Days turned into weeks, and Judith found herself settling into the rhythm of the office. She worked long hours, catching up on cases, learning the firm's culture, and quickly gaining the respect of her colleagues. But amidst all the hustle, there was someone who caught her eye in a way she hadn't anticipated. Philip, the office cleaner. He was always there, quietly going about his duties, wiping down desks, taking out the trash, and ensuring that everything in the office was immaculate. His presence was almost invisible, yet there was a calmness about him that seemed to steady the often chaotic atmosphere of the office. Judith couldn't help but notice the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world to do everything right. But what bothered her the most was the way her colleagues treated him. She had seen it on several occasions: snide remarks, cruel jokes, and condescending comments aimed at Philip. They laughed as if he wasn't even there, mocking him for his unassuming nature. It angered Judith every time, But it wasn't until one incident that she realized how bad it had truly gotten. One afternoon, as she was passing by the break room, she overheard a conversation between two senior associates. "Did you see Philip today? He looked like he didn't even know how to clean properly." One of them laughed, oblivious to Judith's presence. "He probably thinks he's still in the slums of Lagos." The comment was enough to make Judith's blood boil. She stepped into the break room without hesitation, her presence stopping the conversation cold. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "Philip has been working here longer than most of you. Show some respect." The two associates looked taken aback, but they didn't argue. They knew better than to challenge her, especially after seeing the fire in her eyes. Judith wasn't about to let anyone degrade the man who, despite his job, carried himself with more dignity than anyone in that office. From that day on, Judith made it a point to always stand up for Philip. She caught herself doing it more often than she thought she would, when a colleague made a cutting remark or when they ignored him in meetings. She always defended him, even if it meant stepping on a few toes. One late evening, as Judith was working overtime, she noticed Philip in the hallway, quietly scrubbing the floors. She could tell it had been a long day for him. His face was tired, but there was a quiet strength in his posture. She walked over to him, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice soft. "Don't you ever take a break?" Philip looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I take my time when I work," he replied, his voice calm. Judith smiled, impressed by his patience and grace. "Well, you deserve one. Take the rest of the night off. I'll make sure no one bothers you." Philip seemed taken aback by the kindness, but he nodded. "Thank you, I'll be done in a few minutes." As Judith turned to leave, she felt something shift in her heart. It was more than just a desire to protect Philip. It was the realization that, in a world full of arrogance and ego, he was the kind of person she wanted to be around. Quiet, humble, and steady. As weeks passed, Judith found herself talking to Philip more often. They would exchange pleasantries, and sometimes, during the late hours of the night, when the office had quieted down, they would share stories. Judith learned that Philip wasn't just the office cleaner. He had dreams of his own, dreams that went far beyond the confines of the office. "I used to be a tech guy," he told her one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to create applications that would change the world. But life had other plans for me." Judith listened intently, feeling the weight of his words. She had never imagined that the man who cleaned the floors of the prestigious law firm once harbored such grand ambitions. She admired his resilience, how he had managed to keep a sense of self-worth despite the circumstances. "Maybe one day, you'll start again," Judith said, smiling softly. "You never know what the future holds." Philip's eyes lit up for a moment, as though the idea of returning to his old passion was a distant dream that had suddenly become attainable. "Maybe," he said, a quiet hope lingering in his voice. As Judith settled into her new role, she found herself both fighting for her own place in the law firm and protecting the man who had quietly stood by her side. Their bond was unspoken but strong, built on the foundation of mutual respect. Judith had no idea that this simple connection would eventually lead her down a path she never expected, one where loyalty, love, and ambition collided in ways she couldn't have imagined. But for now, she was content. She had found her footing at Harrison and Company, and in doing so, had found someone who saw her not as a single mother fighting for survival, but as someone capable of great things. And in that small act of kindness, standing up for Philip, she had taken her first step towards the future she was destined to create. As the weeks passed, Judith's bond with Philip deepened. Their conversations, initially brief and formal, had become more personal. She learned about his love for literature, his quiet dreams of tech, and the depths of his wisdom. It amazed her how someone who had lived so humbly could possess such profound insights. He had become more than just a cleaner. He had become her unexpected confidant. Tolu, Judith's son, was a bright and curious 7-year-old, and as a single mother, Judith always tried to shield him from the burdens of her career struggles. But one evening, as she worked late at the office, she realized that her son had been asking more questions about Philip. Tolu had noticed the quiet man who always smiled at him, and he had asked why Philip worked so late. "Mom, Does Mr. Philip not have a home to go to? Talou asked one day, his voice innocent but piercing. The question caught Judith off guard. She hadn't realized how much Talou had been observing Philip, how much he'd been picking up on the quiet man who often seemed to disappear into the shadows of the office. No, sweetie, Judith said, kneeling down to her son's level. Mr. Philip is a good man. Sometimes, he works late because he likes to help keep the office clean. But don't worry, he has a home, just like us. Talou nodded, but Judith could tell he didn't quite believe her. That night, after she tucked Talou into bed, an idea began to form in her mind. She wanted to bring Philip into their lives more. She wanted Talou to see him not just as a worker, but as a person. She felt a deep, growing connection with Philip, something she couldn't quite explain, and she wanted her son to experience it too. A few days later, after a particularly challenging day at the office, Judith called Philip and asked if he could do her a favor. Philip, she began, I know this might sound odd, but would you be willing to help me out with Talou? I've got to finish some work, and I need someone to look after him for a few hours. I trust you. Philip hesitated for a moment, then replied with his usual calmness, Of course, I'd be honored. That evening, as Judith rushed home to prepare for a long night of work, she found Philip sitting on the couch in her small living room, playing a quiet game of chess with Talou. The two of them were laughing, sharing jokes and stories. Talou, who had been shy around strangers, seemed completely at ease with Philip. It was as if the man who had once been confined to the background of her life was now part of her family. Seeing them together brought a strange warmth to Judith's chest. She had never expected that her life, already complicated by the demands of her job, would open up to someone like Philip. But here he was, helping her in ways she never imagined. He was becoming an unexpected source of stability, someone who could not only be trusted with her career but with her most cherished possession, her son. The following week, Judith faced her biggest challenge yet, a court case that would test everything she had learned. It was her first real test as a lawyer, and the pressure was enormous. The firm had given her a case involving a high-profile corporate dispute. The odds were stacked against her, and her senior associate, a sharp and demanding man, made it clear that she would either sink or swim. Judith threw herself into the case, working long hours and studying every detail. She barely had time for anything else. But through it all, Philip was there, offering encouragement in his quiet way, even offering to babysit Talou when Judith needed extra hours to prepare. The day of the trial, Judith arrived at the courtroom with a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. She knew she was prepared. As the case unfolded, her strategy began to take shape. Her arguments were sharp, her points clear, and despite the nerves threatening to rise, she maintained a composed, steady demeanor. Philip's presence in her life had given her something she hadn't realized she lacked, a sense of calm amidst chaos. His unwavering belief in her, though unspoken, fueled her determination. She had no idea that a simple janitor would have such a profound impact on her. But somehow, he had helped her find her strength. The courtroom drama ended in her favor. The judge ruled in her client's favor, and Judith stood, stunned but triumphant. Her first case, her first real victory, was hers. She had done it, and it was a victory that would launch her career. As the office buzzed with congratulatory messages, she felt a sense of accomplishment, not just for herself, but for the quiet, humble man who had been there, supporting her when no one else had. That evening, after the victory, Judith called Talou and Philip to the apartment. She had something important to say. I did it, Talou, she said, beaming as she knelt down to him. I won my first case. And I couldn't have done it without Philip. Talou's eyes widened with admiration as he looked at Philip, who simply nodded with a warm smile. For Judith, it wasn't just about the victory in court, it was about how her life was changing, how she was learning to trust others and let them in, and how, in the quietest moments, the most unexpected people could become the greatest allies. As she looked at Philip, who had been so steadfast in his support, Judith knew that this bond, this unlikely friendship, was just the beginning. Her career was taking off, but the most important part of her journey had always been about the people who stood by her. And Philip was one of those people. It all began with a simple gesture, one that Judith never thought would evolve into something so profound. It happened late one evening when she returned home from work, tired but fulfilled after another long day at the office. Tolu had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from his schoolwork, while Philip was in the kitchen, making tea. "Long day?" Philip asked, his voice soothing, as he handed her a cup of freshly brewed chamomile tea. She could tell from the look on his face that he had been waiting for her, as if he knew how much she needed a moment to unwind. "Always," Judith replied, sinking into the armchair. She took a deep breath, letting the aroma of the tea settle her nerves. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Philip sat down across from her, his calm presence making the heavy weight of her thoughts seem lighter. "You're doing fine, Judith," he said quietly. "You've always been stronger than you think." His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within her. Judith realized then that the connection she'd started to feel for Philip was not just born from gratitude or the simple fact that he had been a constant in her chaotic life. There was something more. The way he always made time for her, the way he understood her struggles without needing to ask, it was as if he had always been a part of her life, even when she hadn't known it. As days passed, their relationship deepened in a way Judith never expected. They started spending more time together, dinners, long walks, and late-night conversations about life, dreams, and regrets. Judith found herself laughing more, feeling lighter, even when the world around her seemed so heavy. Philip, with his quiet nature, brought a peace to her that she hadn't realized she needed. It was the small moments, the simple gestures that spoke volumes. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, she came home to find Philip had cleaned the entire apartment, including Tolu's messy playroom, just to give her a break. Tolu, of course, didn't know what to make of it, but Judith saw the love and care in Philip's actions. She realized that this was more than just a friendship. The realization hit her hard one night after dinner. They were sitting on the couch, watching Tolu play video games, when Philip casually placed his hand on hers. At first, Judith froze, unsure of how to react. She had never allowed herself to get too close to anyone after the divorce, but something about Philip made her heart race in a way she couldn't deny. Without thinking, she turned to him. I think I'm falling for you, Philip." Philip looked at her, his brown eyes warm with understanding. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, their quiet, unexpected romance blossomed. The next day, everything seemed to change. Judith couldn't help herself. She smiled more at work, carrying a secret joy in her heart. However, her colleagues noticed the shift. It was subtle at first, whispers when she entered the office, a raised eyebrow when she left the office late at night, but soon, the gossip began to spread like wildfire. "You know, I heard Judith's been spending a lot of time with Philip, the cleaner," one of her colleagues, Linda, said, her voice dripping with mockery. Judith overheard it as she passed the break room. Linda, and some of the other associates, were smirking as they whispered among themselves. It hurt, but Judith wasn't about to let their judgment affect her. She knew they would never understand, and she didn't need them to. She walked into the room, her posture straight and her head held high. "Yes, I've been spending time with Philip," she said, her voice confident, "and I'm proud of it." Her colleagues looked at her, stunned. They hadn't expected such a bold response from Judith, who usually kept her personal life to herself. They didn't know how to react. Linda chuckled bitterly. "A cleaner, Judith? You're dating a man who's a janitor." Judith didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled slightly. "Philip is an intelligent, kind, and thoughtful man. He may work as a cleaner here, but he's far more than that. Maybe you should get to know him before making judgments." The room fell silent, the mockery evaporating as they realized Judith wasn't backing down. Linda tried to respond, but Judith was already walking away, her heart pounding with both defiance and pride. She didn't care what they thought. She had learned enough over the years to know that her happiness wasn't defined by their opinions. That evening, after another late night at the office, Judith called Philip. She had a small, intimate dinner prepared at her apartment, and she wanted to spend the evening with him. They ate together, laughed, and talked about their hopes for the future. As the night wore on, Judith leaned in, her hand resting gently on his. "Philip, I don't care about what they say. I care about what you and I have, she said softly. Philip smiled at her, his warmth and sincerity shining through. I don't care either, Judith. All that matters is you and me. And for the first time in a long while, Judith felt completely at peace. She had found love in the most unlikely place. She had found it in Philip. In the quiet man who had once been invisible, who had become the center of her world. The next day, as Judith walked into the office, she could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Her colleagues were no longer whispering behind her back, but their eyes were fixed on her as she moved about her day. Some were still judgmental, but others watched with a new respect. She had stood up for herself, and for the first time in a long time, Judith realized that she didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. Her relationship with Philip was more than just a love story. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most unexpected love can be the most profound. It was a love built on respect, on shared moments, and on a deep understanding that went beyond labels. And as they continued their journey together, Judith knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The weeks that followed were both exhilarating and challenging. Judith and Philip's relationship had grown stronger, yet the pressures of the outside world never seemed to subside. At the office, the whispers had calmed down a bit, but Judith could still feel the eyes on her. She wasn't sure if they were watching her because of her new relationship with Philip or because of the growing respect she had earned with her recent courtroom victory. Either way, the attention didn't bother her as much as it used to. She had made her peace with it. At home, things were different. The once quiet apartment now echoed with laughter and joy. Tolu had grown fond of Philip, calling him Uncle Phil with an innocent affection. The three of them had developed a rhythm, a routine. Judith would work late at the office while Philip took care of Tolu. Then, when her workday was done, they would have dinner together. Philip had even begun helping her with some of the household chores, easing the burden Judith had always carried alone. But despite the comfort and stability they had found, Judith still found herself battling an undercurrent of anxiety. It wasn't about Philip, she had no doubt about him, but it was about the world outside their little bubble. Could they really make this work? Could a single mother in her position, striving to climb the corporate ladder, make a life with a man who was just a cleaner, even though he was so much more than that? That evening, after a particularly stressful day at the firm, Judith felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The case she was working on had become even more complicated, and the thought of facing another long night in the office made her feel overwhelmed. She hadn't seen Philip all day, and as much as she tried to push her worries aside, she couldn't ignore the tension inside her. When she walked through the door, she was greeted by the familiar sound of Tolu's laughter and the warm aroma of dinner. Philip had cooked, as he often did when she was busy, and the smell was comforting. Tolu ran to her, jumping into her arms. "Mom, Uncle Phil made my favorite, spaghetti," Tolu exclaimed, his eyes bright. Judith smiled, her heart swelling. "That sounds amazing," she said, kneeling down to kiss Tolu on the forehead. As they sat down to eat, Judith couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude wash over her. Philip was everything she had never expected in a partner. He was kind, patient, and always there when she needed him. The weight of the world seemed to lift just a little whenever he was around. After dinner, they all sat in the living room, Tolu absorbed in a game on his tablet. Judith and Philip found themselves alone for the first time that evening. The quiet intimacy of the moment settled between them, and Judith could feel the tension, not just from the day, but from the way her heart fluttered when he was near. There was something magnetic about him. Something she hadn't anticipated. "Judith," Philip said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know it's not easy, all of this. The pressure, the expectations. But I want you to know, I'm here. I'm here, not just for you, but for Tolu, too. I'm not going anywhere." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. The truth was, she had been holding back, afraid of giving too much of herself, afraid of getting hurt. But in this quiet moment, with Philip's gaze steady and reassuring, all of her fears seemed insignificant. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You have no idea how much that means to me." He moved a little closer, his hand brushing against hers. The closeness between them was undeniable, and the air between them shifted. Judith's heart raced as she looked into his eyes that had seen her at her worst and still remained filled with warmth and understanding. She didn't know when it happened, but at that moment, she realized she didn't just care for him. She was in love with him. Without thinking, she reached up, cupping his face in her hands. The world seemed to slow down around them. Philip's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, everything outside of the room ceased to exist. He leaned in slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, tentative kiss. It was gentle at first, as though testing the waters, but as Judith melted into the kiss, it deepened, the heat between them rising. It was a kiss filled with the promise of something more than just the shared quiet moments, more than the stolen glances. It was the beginning of something real. When they finally pulled away, Judith's breath was shallow, her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The kiss had said everything. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," Philip murmured, his voice hoarse. Judith chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Me too," she admitted, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and excitement. Just then, Tolu looked up from his tablet, his innocent voice breaking the moment. "Mom, Uncle Phil, what are you two doing?" he asked, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Judith and Philip exchanged a look, both laughing at Tolu's timing. Judith quickly stood up, brushing off the awkwardness. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just talking," she said, ruffling Tolu's hair as she moved toward the kitchen. But as Judith washed the dishes, her heart still racing from the kiss, she realized that their love, no matter how unconventional it seemed, was real. It wasn't about titles, or jobs, or the opinions of others. It was about two people finding each other in the most unlikely of places and deciding to take a chance. As the night went on, Judith felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't alone. With Philip by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The office buzzed with energy as Judith sat at her desk, going over the case files for a potential client that could make or break her position at Harrison & Company. It was one of the biggest contracts the firm had been chasing, and everyone knew that getting this client on board would elevate the firm's reputation and bring in a significant amount of business. But the more Judith looked at the files, the more she realized how daunting it was to land them. This wasn't just a client, it was a tech giant, a firm that was as elusive as they were powerful. She'd been working tirelessly on the pitch for weeks, but every meeting, every phone call, seemed to slip further away from her grasp. The senior partners were breathing down her neck, making it clear that they needed results, now. Sighing, Judith leaned back in her chair, her fingers massaging her temples. "I don't know how I'm going to get this one," she muttered to herself. "They won't even return my calls." Philip, who was silently sweeping the floors nearby, overheard her. He had been working at Harrison & Company for a while now, always in the background, but never once had he said anything about the work the lawyers were doing. However, today was different. He paused for a moment, watching her. She had been under so much pressure lately. The stress was beginning to take its toll on her, and he could see it in the way her shoulders were slumped, the tiredness in her eyes. "Judith," Philip said, his voice low, "I think I can help you." She turned toward him, startled by his words. "Help me? With what?" He hesitated before speaking again. "I know someone. Someone who can help with this client." Judith frowned, unsure of what he meant. "You know someone. Who?" Philip glanced around the office to make sure no one was listening. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm not just a cleaner here, Judith. I've worked with some big names in the business world. If you need access to people, if you need to get through to someone important, I can make that happen." Her confusion only deepened. "You're saying you know someone who can help me with this client. But you're a janitor, Philip. How is that possible?" Philip gave her a small smile. "I may clean the floors here, but I've spent a lot of time in high-powered circles. I've learned things along the way, and sometimes, that's all it takes." Judith stared at him, unsure of what to make of his words. She had always known Philip was more than just a cleaner, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "You've been in high-powered circles." "Yes," he said simply. "And I can connect you to the right people." Judith took a deep breath, still skeptical but desperate for a breakthrough. All right, Philip. If you think you can help me, I'll give it a shot. But I need this client. I can't afford to fail. The next day, after work, Judith met with Philip in a quiet corner of the office building. He had arranged for a meeting with someone high up in the tech industry, the very company she had been trying to land. Judith was nervous. She had no idea how Philip had managed to pull this off, but she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she had ever thought. They drove to an upscale part of Lagos, a place Judith had only seen in passing but never visited. The sleek glass buildings towered above them, and the wealth of the area was palpable. They entered a high-rise building, and Judith felt a wave of nervous energy rise within her. She wasn't used to this kind of world. She was still fighting to make her mark in the legal world, but this felt like a completely different game. As they entered a lavish office suite, Judith was greeted by a man she didn't recognize. He stood up as soon as he saw Philip, his expression warm, almost reverential. "Philip," the man said, shaking his hand with familiarity. "It's good to see you again. Who do you have here?" "This is Judith," Philip said, introducing her with a quiet smile. "She's trying to land your company as a client." The man turned his gaze to Judith, sizing her up for a moment. His look wasn't dismissive, but it was calculating. "Well, if Philip trusts you, that's enough for me." The conversation that followed was fast-paced and full of words Judith wasn't used to hearing. But as the meeting went on, she realized just how much influence Philip held in these circles. The way he spoke, the connections he made, the subtle gestures that spoke volumes, he was navigating this world like he belonged here. And Judith? She was just trying to keep up. As the meeting came to a close, the man shook her hand firmly. "Consider this deal done. You've got the client. We'll start working out the details, and you'll be hearing from us soon." Judith couldn't believe it. She had done it. No, they had done it. She had landed the client, and it was all thanks to Philip. But as she walked out of the building, her mind was racing. How had he managed this? Judith's heart was still racing from the victory with the client. The firm was thrilled, and so was she. The satisfaction of securing the deal was unlike anything she had felt before. But a part of her couldn't shake the strange feeling that Philip's involvement in the whole thing had been more than just helping her out. His connection to the client had been too smooth, too effortless. She had worked tirelessly, and yet, it was Philip who had truly made the deal happen. Sitting at her desk the morning after the announcement, Judith couldn't concentrate. She replayed everything in her head. The way he had spoken so confidently about the tech industry, the business lingo he casually threw around. It hadn't fully clicked at the time, but now that she thought about it, it was starting to make sense. "I have to ask him," she muttered under her breath. "I have to know." Later that evening, as she sat across from Philip in her cozy living room, a quiet tension had settled between them. They had been talking about everything and nothing, about Toulouse school play and the latest project at the firm, but Judith's mind was elsewhere. The question that had been lingering for days now seemed unavoidable. "Philip," she began, her voice steady but laced with curiosity, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Philip looked at her, his expression open yet unreadable. "What's on your mind?" "You helped me get the client." "I know that," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "But, how? How did you know what they needed? How did you get the meeting with them so easily? This wasn't a normal pitch. You seemed to have too much access." Philip remained silent for a moment, his gaze lingering on her, and for the first time since their relationship had started, Judith could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then, slowly, he took a deep breath, as if he were bracing himself. "Judith, there's something I haven't told you," he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "The truth is, I own the company you've been trying to land as a client." Judith blinked, taken aback. "You own it?" "Yes," he confirmed. "It is my company before it became the powerhouse it is now. But I stepped back from it for a long time. I didn't want to be involved in the business anymore. And I certainly didn't want anyone to know I was connected to it. That's why I've kept my identity a secret." Judith felt the room spin as she tried to process what he was saying. So, when you told me you knew the people behind the company, you meant you were the one behind it all? Yes, Philip said, his voice soft. I knew that if I wanted to live the life I wanted, I had to leave the business world behind. So I distanced myself. But when you needed help with that client, I knew exactly how to make it happen. Judith couldn't speak for a moment, her mind reeling from the shock of his confession. The man she had been falling for, the man she had trusted, was the very person she had been working so hard to impress. It felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. How could she have missed this? But then, something else clicked. The pieces began to fall into place, the subtle hints, the way Philip had always been so calm and composed, even when the stakes were high. This man was more than just the humble cleaner who had come into her life. He was a man with a powerful past, a man who had once controlled a vast empire. I'm sorry, Judith, Philip continued, his voice tinged with regret. I didn't want you to see me as a billionaire, or a businessman. I wanted you to see me for who I am now. For who I've become. Judith sat back, still processing the revelation. The room felt heavy, but her emotions were a mix of disbelief and understanding. She had fallen for Philip because of his kindness, his honesty, and his simplicity. It wasn't the money that had drawn her to him, and it still wasn't. But now, his truth had changed the entire landscape of their relationship. I never wanted anyone to love me for my money, Philip said, almost as if reading her thoughts. That's what happened with my ex-girlfriend. She only loved the lifestyle, not me. When I realized that, I couldn't handle it. I left everything behind, and I've been trying to find peace ever since. Judith watched him, her heart aching for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. He had sacrificed everything, his company, his wealth, his past life, for the chance to find someone who truly loved him, not for what he had, but for who he was. You've been hiding from it all, Judith said softly, her voice filled with empathy. And now, you've found me. Philip nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. I have. But I don't want to hide anymore, Judith. Not from you. I want to build something real with you. And I know this might seem overwhelming, but I can't do this without you. I want you in my life, fully, without any secrets. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of their shared vulnerability. Judith's heart was still racing, her emotions a whirlpool of confusion, admiration, and love. She had always prided herself on her independence, on making her own way. But now, faced with the reality of Philip's past, she had to admit that she wasn't sure what to make of it. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, she knew one thing for certain. You don't have to hide from me, Philip, she said, her voice firm and steady. I don't care about the money. I care about you. Philip's eyes softened, and a small, relieved smile tugged at his lips. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but full of meaning. Thank you, he whispered. You have no idea how much that means to me. And then, in that quiet moment, something shifted between them. Something deeper, something stronger. It was as if all the barriers they had built, all the uncertainties they had carried, had vanished in the air between them. Without another word, Philip stood up, walking toward her with a determination that made Judith's pulse quicken. He knelt down in front of her, taking her hand in his. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Judith, he began, his voice low and full of emotion. I love you. Not because of what you do or what you have. I love you because you're the first person to see me for who I really am. Will you marry me? Judith's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that, after all the twists and turns, she would be standing at the precipice of something so real, so irrevocable. Yes, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Yes, Philip. I'll marry you. The room was silent, but in that silence, everything became clear. The man she had once thought was just a humble cleaner was now the man who held her heart. And as they shared a tender kiss, sealing their promise, Judith knew that whatever challenges they faced, together, they could face anything. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to love, to trust, and to build a future with the person who truly saw her for who she was. And with Philip by her side, She knew their love story had only just begun. Judith was walking on air as she sat at her desk, the morning sunlight streaming through the office windows, making the day feel brighter than usual. Her colleagues had already begun to gossip, but today, she wasn't paying attention to any of it. All she could think about was her upcoming wedding. She had spent weeks planning every detail, picking out the perfect dress, arranging the perfect venue, and, most importantly, creating the perfect moment to marry the man who had turned her world upside down in the best possible way. As she sat down at her desk, she took a deep breath, knowing she couldn't wait any longer. She pulled out the stack of wedding invitations she had been meaning to give to her colleagues. Philip had resigned from his role as the office cleaner weeks ago. He had returned to his company, leaving the life he had once built behind and returning to the world he had once abandoned. But now, with the wedding around the corner, Judith couldn't hold back her excitement. She wanted to share this part of her life with the people she had worked so hard alongside. With a smile, she went around to her colleagues' desks, handing out the beautifully designed wedding cards. "I'd love for you all to come," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "It's going to be a small ceremony, but it would mean a lot to me if you could be there." Her colleagues exchanged surprised glances, some offering polite smiles, others awkwardly avoiding her eyes. Judith had never really talked about her personal life with them. Her focus had always been on her work. But now, with her wedding approaching, it felt natural to share this piece of her life. As she handed one last card to Linda, the senior associate who had never been particularly kind, Judith noticed the way Linda's smile faltered when she saw the name on the invitation. "You're marrying Philip?" Linda asked, her voice dripping with mockery. Judith nodded, her smile unwavering. "Yes, Philip Westbrook. He's a wonderful man." The room grew strangely quiet as Linda glanced at the invitation again, disbelief etched across her face. "But, Philip, the cleaner?" she asked incredulously. Her tone was loud enough for the others to overhear, and it wasn't long before the rest of the office caught on. A ripple of whispers spread through the office. Judith could hear them, some of them chuckled, while others whispered behind their hands. "A cleaner? She's marrying a cleaner asterisk." One of them murmured. Judith's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "He's a wonderful man, and I love him." The gossip continued to swirl around her, but Judith refused to be drawn into the negativity. She had made her choice, and it was the right one for her. She didn't need their approval. Still, she couldn't help but feel the sting of their judgment. It wasn't the first time they had mocked her for her relationship with Philip, but now, on the verge of her wedding, it felt different. They had no idea who Philip truly was. As the days passed, Judith continued with her wedding preparations, but her colleagues' mockery still lingered. It was as if they couldn't believe she was serious about marrying Philip. They saw him as nothing more than a humble janitor, someone who didn't belong in their world of high-powered law associates. The day of the wedding arrived, and Judith was ready. She stepped into the car with Talou by her side, the dress she had chosen for the ceremony a perfect blend of elegance and simplicity. Her heart was full, and she couldn't wait to marry the man she had come to love so deeply. When they arrived at the venue, however, she was taken aback by the sheer scale of it. The venue was nothing like she had imagined. The grand estate, set amidst beautifully manicured gardens, was a far cry from the simple ceremony she had originally planned. The guests were well dressed, the atmosphere pristine. Judith hadn't seen the full extent of Philip's resources, but now she was starting to realize just how grand this wedding would be. As she entered the venue, she saw her colleagues in the crowd, their eyes wide with surprise. They had been invited, of course, but none of them had expected this level of luxury. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the soft sound of classical music filled the air, and the reception hall was bathed in golden light. Everything about the wedding was extravagant, and Judith's colleagues were left speechless. They were too polite to voice their shock, but the whispers spread quickly. "I had no idea Philip was this wealthy," one of them muttered under her breath. Judith stood at the altar, her heart racing as she glanced at her colleagues in the crowd. She noticed the same faces who had mocked her for dating a cleaner now looking at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They didn't understand. They couldn't see Philip for who he really was, someone who had built an empire, someone who had sacrificed it all for the chance to live a simpler life. When Philip appeared, standing at the altar waiting for her, Judith's breath caught in her throat. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-made suit, his presence commanding and yet tender. He was no longer the man she had first met, the humble cleaner in the office, but someone even more remarkable. He was the man she had chosen to spend the rest of her life with. As they exchanged vows, Judith felt her heart swell. She had never imagined that she would find love like this, not in a world filled with judgment and expectations. But here, at this moment, surrounded by the people who had once doubted them, she knew without a doubt that Philip was the one she had been waiting for all her life. The reception was a dream. The guests were treated to a lavish meal, and the night stretched on in a blur of laughter, dancing, and celebration. Judith couldn't stop smiling. She was finally where she was meant to be. Later, Judith found herself surrounded by her colleagues, their expressions now filled with awe. It wasn't long before Linda, the senior associate who had been the loudest in mocking her relationship, approached. She was a little flushed from the wine, but there was a new respect in her eyes. "I didn't know," Linda said, her voice softer than usual. "I didn't know Philip was, well, you know. I'm sorry for how I acted." Judith smiled, her heart no longer feeling burdened by the past. "It's okay," she replied. "You didn't know. But now you do." For the rest of the evening, her colleagues treated her with a newfound respect. The whispers had stopped, replaced by curiosity and admiration. They saw Philip for who he truly was, a self-made billionaire, a man of depth and integrity, not just a humble cleaner. As the night drew to a close, Judith stood beside Philip on the balcony of the estate, looking out at the city lights below. He took her hand in his touch warm and steady. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Judith turned to him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "More than I ever imagined." He smiled, a soft smile filled with meaning. "I knew you were the one. And now, we have everything we need." Judith leaned into him and kissed him. The past was behind them. The judgments, the mockery, it didn't matter anymore. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. In that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, surrounded by the luxury of a wedding they never expected, Judith knew that her life had changed forever.